J.Edgar Hoover, Part 2, Scene 10, Take 37, Action.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the History and Mystery channel. I'm your host, Chronicler, and I want you to like and subscribe. Now that you have done that, I want to delve into Part 2 of our story. A story about the first director of the FBI, J.Edgar Hoover. And today we will learn how the FBI operated during World War II and how Hoover put even more power towards his office. How he did that, we will see in the next 3 chapters of our story. And those chapters are the rise of fascism in America, Hoover's fight against communists during the second half of the 1930s, and World War II. So let's start with chapter 1. While J.Edgar Hoover was fighting the public enemies that rose up during the Great Depression in the United States, the Great Depression would also bring a rise to some new political parties and potential foreign enemies. As we know, communism was established as a new political system in the Soviet Union, and this political system also started to become more popular in other nations that were suffering from the Great Depression. Hoover already dealt some massive blows to the American communists during the 1920s, but his greatest fear was still there, and he wanted nothing more than to get back to fighting it, now that his war on the public enemies was won. There was only one other thing that was also happening in the world, and that was the rise of fascism and the ascent of Adolf Hitler to the position of Chancellor of Germany in the year 1933. Adolf used the Great Depression to his advantage and started changing the German constitution and rule of law towards his liking. His political ideas helped the German economy recover, and this is something that groups in America started to notice. And now that the American economy was in one of its worst states in history, with an unemployment rate of 24.9% and a Dow Jones average that was sputtering from a low 50 to a high of 108, thanks to this, the fascist groups became more popular in the United States, and in the year 1933, a group of businessmen would approach an American general and war hero named Smedley Butler to lead a fascist coup d'etat against the government. The plan was to dethrone President Roosevelt and install Butler as their fascist dictator. Unfortunately for them, but luckily for Roosevelt, Butler had become an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist, which is why Butler in the year 1934 decided to testify before Congress that he was approached by a group of fascists that wanted to lead him in their overthrow of the government. However, there was little evidence to back up Butler's claims, and that's why there never came an investigation into it. But what it did do is scare President Roosevelt, and because of that, Roosevelt decided to organize a conference meeting on the fascist issue in America on May the 9th, 1934. The people that attended this meeting were Attorney General Homer Cummings, the Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins, the Secret Service Chief William H. Moran, and of course our good old friend, the Director of the FBI, J.Edgar Hoover. The question that Roosevelt would ask during the conference was, should Nazi groups in the US be investigated? The conference members said yes, but under what law? The members started to talk and think about all the laws they had, and later the members would agree that the immigration laws would offer a solid ground for an investigation into the foreign connections to the domestic fascist groups that the domestic fascist groups might have. Hoover's FBI was given the assignment to work with the Secretary of Immigration on this issue, and the Secret Service would offer some assistance. When Hoover arrived back at the FBI headquarters, he would give out an order to all the FBI's field offices in the United States. And this order would tell the agents to open up an investigation into the threats posed by domestic groups that were connected to fascist Germany in their assigned region. In the beginning, it wouldn't amount to much, but this would all change in 1936 when the Bureau started to receive new orders from President Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull. These orders fell in line with the newly adopted Foreign Agents Registration Act. The President ordered the Bureau to do more extensive investigations into the fascist groups. These investigations would lead to the substantial results. For example, it led to the discovery of 50 Nazi spies that were operating in the United States, including a massive spy ring led by a German agent named Fritz Duquesne, if I say that right. Our good old friend Hoover did spend some time on hunting fascist agents, but not as much time as he would on his main enemy, the communists. Just like the fascists, the communists would also rise in popularity during the Great Depression. To better understand the time period, we have to take a look at the work of author Ted Morgan, because he would note that the Great Depression allowed the Communist Party to transform itself into a champion of the unemployed. The labor union movement would grow, the Communist Party would grow, and also Hoover's fear of a communist takeover would grow. President Roosevelt would even add some more oil on the flames that Hoover saw in American society by officially recognizing the Soviet Union. Thanks to FDR's recognition of the Soviet Union, the young communist country was allowed to open up embassies in the United States. By opening up embassies, the Soviets would also get the ability to use them as a doorway for their spies to enter American soil, which was one of Hoover's biggest fears, and not without reason, because in the nearby future, the Soviets would use their embassies and other diplomatic routes to get their spies into the United States. Because of Hoover's fears and the fact that he had no evidence that the Soviets were using the embassies to smuggle in spies, he had to come up with a trick to make FDR believe that the threat was real. Hoover would do this in August 1936 by telling the president that communists had infiltrated the labor unions of 3 major industries: shipping, coal, and the press. He told the president that these 3 industries, with the help of communist-led unions, could paralyze the entire United States economy. Hoover wanted nothing more than that his bureau would become the one to perform a major intelligence gathering of these communist-led labor unions. But there was a problem. Hoover's FBI did not have the authority to do this. But what he did find out is that there was a statute from the 1960s that said that the State Department could enlist the FBI to investigate political dissidents. When FDR learned about this, he called for a meeting with Hoover and the Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Hoover said that during this meeting, FDR told them that both the communists and the fascists were under scope, that the communists in particular were under the direct control of Moscow. After FDR said this to the Secretary of State Cordell Hull, turned to Hoover and gave him the green light to start his investigation. By doing this, he basically gave Hoover the authority to spy on all Americans under the motto of fighting communism. And Hoover would only know one way of fighting, a way that was aggressive and dirty, just like he did during the Palmer raids. Thanks to all of this, Hoover made the FBI the #1 domestic spy agency, but he wasn't the only domestic spy agency. The military had multiple agencies, just like the State Department. Hoover didn't mind working with them, but when it came down to spying on the civilian, he wanted the FBI to be the only one. And this is something that would change into his favor after September the 1st, 1939, also known as the day that fascist Germany invaded Poland. It's the year 1939, and the Austrian painter, also known as Adolf Hitler, decided to brutally invade his Polish neighbor, which would mark the beginning of World War II in Europe. This invasion would send shock waves through the world. The British Commonwealth and the French would declare war on Germany. Italy joined the Germans to their alliance, the Pact of Steel, but the Americans, under the leadership of Roosevelt, would declare that the US would stay neutral. At the same time, FDR would also declare that all the investigation and espionage agencies of the United States would fall under the direct control of Hoover's FBI. In this way, FDR made sure that if something would happen, his agencies would be united and ready to fight. Now that Hoover received all this power, he did what most people do when they receive a lot of power, and that is abuse it. For example, he created the custodial detention program, which was a list of immigrants and citizens of the US that could be sent to internment camps if the circumstances demanded it. All of this abusing and using of power wouldn't go unnoticed, and when General Robert Jackson found out, he was furious about it. But not for the right reason, not because of the violations of human rights and privacy that the program committed. General Robert Jackson was furious because Hoover was in control of it and not him. The conflict between Hoover and Jackson about who has the biggest ding-dong and who is the better spy would only grow. And this conflict would only calm down when the Supreme Court in December of 1939 decided that the usage of wiretapping is illegal. General Jackson decided to abide by the court's order, but of course our good old friend J.Edgar Hoover decided to make a plan so that he could override the Supreme Court's ruling. His plan was to inform the Treasury Department about some information that he received about German spies working in Buffalo, Canada, that he could not help the Canadian Mounted Police that, according to him, desperately needed his assistance and specifically needed the FBI's wiretapping abilities. Only one day after making this claim, his message reached the president, who decided to rule in his favor for the sake of national security. Instead of giving Hoover the right to perform wiretapping for the coming year or for the duration of the war in Europe, which would sound logical, FDR decided to give Hoover the right to use wiretapping for the next 25 years. And during those 25 years, Hoover decided to at least use it 7,000 times without a warrant and placed around $1,800 for as far as we know. Now that we arrive in the year 1940, with a full-scale war in Europe and a Sino-Japanese war in the East, multiple FBI agents would put their focus on South America as part of the Bureau's Special Intelligence Service, which was established in the year 1940 as a response to an order of President Roosevelt. For the people that are wondering why the FBI is doing all the foreign operations and espionage, that is because the CIA wasn't created yet. But let's get back to South America, because South America in 1940 became a hotbed for German Reich supporters. This was partly because of a big influx of German immigrants in countries like Brazil and Argentina, but also in the political landscape, a lot of politicians became sympathetical towards the German cause. Something that FDR wasn't too happy about. And that's why Hoover's agents went undercover to take out multiple German spy nests in South America. Besides their undercover operations, Hoover would also start with officially stationing FBI agents as diplomatic liaisons in the United States embassies, which is something You could call the forerunner of today's legal attachés. In the year 1941, the FBI would have almost doubled its employees from 2,432 in 1940 to 4,477 in February 1941. Hoover would even plan to reach 5,588 employees by June of the same year. To fund this expansion, Congress would provide the FBI with $14 million, which is the equivalent of $293 million in 2024. Hoover's response to this sudden influx of money for his bureau was to launch a major wiretapping campaign of the German, French, Italian, Soviet and Japanese embassies. Hoover would also use it to wiretap anybody that showed sympathy towards a foreign power, including striking workers and critics of the White House. On July the 11th, 1941, FDR decided to create the COI, aka Coordinator of Information, which would later be renamed into the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. Hoover hated this because he liked being the only one on the top of the intelligence community. And when Hoover found out how poorly the OSS was run in its early days, he decided to infiltrate and spy on their activities. Hoover would also have access to all of the files of OSS agents, because he was responsible of running their background checks. Now that Hoover was busy with wasting his resources and time on attacking an allied agency, he would completely miss a real threat to the United States, because on June 1941, the FBI learned that Nazi spies were feeding information to the Japanese about Hawaiian Islands. If that wasn't a big enough hint, a British double agent would inform the FBI that the Japanese were asking questions about defenses of Pearl Harbor. Hoover was known to distrust double agents, which would explain why he would not trust the information given by them. Either way, Hoover made an intelligence age error, and on the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor and pull the Americans into World War II. As we know, the FBI made a couple intelligence errors in the lead up to American involvement in World War II. But let's not forget that there was no other organization in America so well prepared for a war as the FBI under the leadership of Hoover. For example, the Bureau created lists with potential threats to the US from both foreign and domestic. And within 3 days of the attack, newly appointed General Francis Biddle would sign off on warrants for all of the names on Hoover's list. Thanks to this, Hoover could start with multiple operations, like arresting suspects, expanding his wiretapping network, opening up mailboxes, raiding houses, threatening journalists with jail time, and as a cherry on top of the pie, Hoover was even given the authority to inspect all of the telecommunication throughout the United States. Hoover would use this authority to demand cable companies like Western Union and RCA to let the FBI examine and read telegrams before they could be sent through. As you could expect, all these actions would lead to some victories for the FBI, like the arrest of a Nazi spy ring under the leadership of George Dash. This spy ring was found guilty for smuggling guns, explosives, and German uniforms into the United States. In the summer of 1943, an anonymous Russian letter would arrive at the FBI headquarters. This letter would claim that there were more than 10 Soviet spies working undercover as diplomats in the United States. After learning about this, Hoover was shocked but not surprised. The FBI had mostly been focused on fighting a war against the Axis powers. But now that they learned about a potential Soviet spy network in the US, the FBI had to shift some of their attention back home. The first thing that they would do is confirm the authenticity of the letter, and they would say that it was credible and that its author was well versed in Soviet intelligence. Because of this, the FBI launched a major investigation into the connections between the Soviets and the Communist Party of America. Through this case, called Comrade, the FBI learned that Soviet spying on United States soil was a major threat and helped the Bureau prepare for the Cold War to come. In 1944, Hoover's FBI would reach more than 13,000 employees, and Hoover would make use of them all. And during the last couple months of the year, his agents had a lot on their plate. The threat of German spies entering the United States to either wreak havoc or infiltrate only got higher the longer the war progressed. And that's why I want to take you guys to the German city of Kiel in September 1944. In this city, two German spies called Erich Gimpel, a 34-year-old intelligence operative, and William Kolpow, a 26-year-old American-born defector, would enter the U-boat called U-1230. When the agents entered the U-boat, they knew that they had signed up for a long and dangerous trip through the Atlantic. A trip in which they had to dodge American and British destroyers that were hunting for German submarines. Once they finished crossing the ocean and arrived in American waters, they had to wait 8 more days at the ocean floor to avoid American patrols. When the spies saw that the surface was clear, they rose up from the bottom and inflated a rubber boat, which they would use to get to a town called Maine. After entering the quiet town, they had to hike 8 kilometers to get to the US Route 1. Once they arrived there, they flagged down a cab and made their way to Boston and then to New York City by train. The agents carried fake identification papers, a catch of 99 diamonds, a Leica camera with a special lens for copying documents, secret ink, 2 Kroll wristwatches, microdots, 2 32 caliber Colt automatic pistols, and $60,000 of cash, which is around like 1 million in today's money. The agents would rent an apartment under their fake names, which were Edward Green for Gimpel and William Caldwell for Kolpow. Now that they were all set and ready to gather information for the Germans, Kolpow decided to do something else and spend the money on liquor, women, and all of the other exciting entertainment New York had to offer. Gimpel stayed focused on the task at hand, but also fell victim to the sins of the city. After doing this for some time, Kolpow started to feel guilty for betraying his country and decided to meet up with his old friend Edmund Mulcahy, who gave him the advice to turn himself in. Kolpow did this and betrayed Gimpel. Kolpow thought by doing this that he would be spared by the judges, but both of the spies got sentenced to death in February 1945, but this sentence would be changed into life imprisonment by Harry S. Truman after the war. The Americans nuked Japan and the Soviets raised their flags in Berlin. These two events would mark the end of World War II, but the beginning of a new conflict. Hoover's greatest enemies had taken over Eastern Europe, half of Germany, raised an Iron Curtain, started financing communist uprisings, and their spies became more aggressive and even stole the plans for the nuclear bomb by successfully infiltrating the Manhattan Project. Hoover's hunt for foreign spies had started. But that's a story for another day. I want to thank you all for listening. See you in the next one. And remember, history is written in mystery.